and advantages of home ownership. So your home purchase is going to be probably the biggest purchase you'll ever make, and you're going to be paying for it for a long time. So let's just talk about what's involved in the economics as well as just some of the specifics. So the first thing is, what is your monthly payment? And the calculation of the monthly payment is exactly the way that the monthly payment is calculated for a car loan. There's actually a formula for that. I'm not sure if it's in this class or not. I said there's probably a formula for that, but it's fairly complicated. It's not as complicated as I remember it. So I'm just going to show you how this thing works, and then we'll. The other way would be to go online and find a home payment calculator and put in the pieces of information. So the input is the number of dollars for the loan, what your annual interest rate is, and how many years you're going to pay it off. So let's just look at a specific example. So let's say I buy a $150,000 home, and the interest rate is 4.5% yearly, and we're going to do it for 30 years, which is the most typical payment, even though it actually is better to pay it off sooner because you're paying less interest. And we'll see how much interest you actually pay on a home loan. It's significantly larger as a percentage than for a car loan because the length of the loan is so much longer. So our equation says that the monthly payment is going to be P, which is the principal, that's the original loan, times the rate, and use a decimal equivalent of 4.5%. You divide by 12. The 12 comes from the fact you have 12 payments per year. You take 1 minus the quantity 12 divided by 12 plus the yearly interest rate in decimal form, and you raise that to the 12 times the number of years, which is 30. So there's lots of ways to make errors on this calculation, and I'm just going to do little bits of it just to show you what the values are of each part. And it seems kind of funny because if you think about 12 is the number of months, but the interest rate is yearly interest rate. It seems kind of confusing at first. It seems like you're mixing the wrong things, but ultimately you're not. It does work out correctly. So so I'll have 150,000 times, this is basically the monthly interest rate. The yearly interest rate divided by the number of months. So let's just calculate what that is. 0.045 divided by 12 is 0.00375. So the monthly interest rate is 0.375%. And then we divide by 1 minus this to the 12 times 30 is going to be equal to 360 payments. So that'll be to the 360th power. So we'll take 12 divided by 12.045, and we raise that to the 360th power. And that doesn't look right. Okay. Oh, I divided by 360. I wonder, I wasn't right. Okay, let's try it again. Raise it. The divide side's next to the. Okay. So I get 0.657. That's the result of that part of the calculation. So if I subtract one from that, All right, subtract that from 1. I get 0.3428. And so now I'll do the final calculation. 150,000 times 0.00375 divided by 0.3428. And I get $1,640.89. So it's not a super hard calculation. It's also a lot of money. Yeah. That seems too high. There's something wrong here. Let's just go to the next page and confirm it, and then I'll go back and find the error if I made an error. See, something doesn't seem quite right. That seems too high. So the other way is they have tables. This is a table that's in your book. And the way you use the table is you go down to the interest rate, which is 4.5%. You go to 30 years. You get this multiplying factor, 5.06685. This one right here. So you take that number, 5.06685, and that's the monthly payment on a $1,000 mortgage would be $5.06, approximately $5.07. But we have a $150,000 mortgage, so you multiply it by a factor of 150. And 5.06685 times 150 to get $150,000 mortgage, and you end up with a payment of $760.03, which is wrong. So that's why, yeah. So I made a mistake on the previous calculation. So let me see what I did wrong. So 12 divided by 12.045 raised to the 360th power. Well, that looks right, but I know I did this yesterday and I didn't get an answer. So let me, what am I doing wrong here? Oh, I didn't divide by the right thing. I did it twice though. So it's 12.045. I did 12.0145. That was my problem. Okay, raise that to the 360th power. Okay, that looks better. Okay, so that number is incorrect. So this number should be 0.2599 approximately. And therefore I subtract that from 1 and I get 0.7401. And then if I correct it now, so 150,000 times 0.00375, the monthly interest rate divided by 0.74001, and I get $760.03, okay, which is exactly what I got using the table. So if you know, probably 50 years ago, if you were a banker, you had a table like this, and you were able to quickly, through some reasonably simple math, multiplication, to come up with the amount that a mortgage is. You wouldn't use the formula unless you wanted to just prove that you're a good math student or something like that. So anyway, that's the order of magnitude of the mortgage. And you think about rents. I don't know what rents are around here, but I think for a $150,000 house, $750 is probably a reasonable rent for a single-family home. So it's, first you might say, well, looks like it's just as cheap to buy as it is to rent, from just a payment to pay off the mortgage. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a minute. This is a little historical information about mortgage rates. So we have 15 rate. The red line is the 30-year mortgage, fixed rate mortgage. So the payment stays the same over the entire 30 years of the mortgage. The brown light brown is a 15-year mortgage. So you can see that the 15-year mortgage is usually a lower interest rate than the 30-year mortgage. Then you have these adjustable rate mortgages, which you can usually get a lower interest rate when you buy the house, but they have the possibility of being adjusted based on the inflation rate and the rate that the Federal Reserve charges. Those are closely tied. The prime rate is what the Federal Reserve, this is a, kind of indicative of, well, it's usually set by the government to try to to either jumpstart the economy or to minimize inflation. Sometimes those are competing factors. And a one-year CMT index, that's probably, I don't know what that stands for. Okay, but anyway, you can see the fluctuations. And this goes to February of 2013. And they continue to go down somewhat. They're around 4.5% right now, maybe 4%. So they can't go much below that, really. When I bought our house, it was in 1986, which is a little bit before this. But they do go up and down, depending upon when you buy your house. You're kind of stuck with the interest rates at that particular time. If you bought your house, for example, you took out a loan in 2000, which is about here, the interest rates are high. What people might do is, in 2003, they may do what's called refinance their house at a lower mortgage rate to save money, to lower your monthly payments. So that is an option. You're not forever stuck with the interest rate that you have, even with a fixed rate mortgage. It does cost money to refinance your house, but the savings over the long run may be more than the extra you have to pay. There's always a trade-off. Here's another graph, a little simpler. This one does show 1986, and so we got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which is probably this one right here. Yeah, it's that one right there. It was almost 11% versus 4% now. So you'd be paying your monthly payments for the same value house, same amount house would be like over 2 times as much. So if you had a mortgage of $700, now you'd be paying $1,500 back then, relatively speaking. So when we bought our house, we refinanced in about 1990 something. As the interest rates had gone down, then it stayed pretty level for a long time. We paid off our house in 2000. So from the time that we refinanced to the time that we paid it off, we ended up paying more than we had to, so that we paid it off in about 14 years instead of 30 years. And what you do by that is you save interest over the long run. Our oldest daughter went to college in 2000, so we paid off our last mortgage payment, I think it was in May of that year, and she went off to college in September, so the money just went from the bank to Virginia Tech. It was about the same amount of money. And here's another. This is different. This is actually CD rates, but mortgage rates and CD rates, because they're sort of governed by the same factor, which is the rate that the Federal Reserve charges. They closely match it. So again, 1986, the interest rates on CDs were almost 8%, which is pretty good. But then in 1990, when the dot-com boom crashed and the stock market went down, they lowered the interest rates to try to stimulate the economy, but as a consequence, they also had to lower the CD rates. And this goes to 2011. This was in the housing crisis when the stock market dropped again, and they've been extremely low since then. So you haven't been able to get much money by investing in CDs. But at some point in history, historically they've been 4 to 5%, which is reasonable. This was when there was high inflation. This is when they're low, is when there's usually some economic problem, just to try to stimulate the economy. But It's not a viable way to save much money at that point. Yeah, and this actually goes back further, back to 1960. So prior to 2000, the CD rates didn't go below, I don't know where the scale is here, about 2%. But they averaged, if you just drew your hand through here, you would come over here and you would see they were at a reasonable rate. So what you've seen in your lifetime is not typical of what you would have seen over the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But then again, there was a lot of inflation right here. So it's, you're kind of balancing making money versus the value of your money going down at that particular point. And there's some discussion about adjustable rate mortgages, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there are limits on how much they can increase the rate from one year to the next, how the rate is set. Usually it's based on U.S. Treasury security rates, which is kind of what I was talking about here. But we don't need to get into the details. Ideally, you would get a fixed interest rate loan. That's the one that makes the most sense over the long term. Okay, so now that we kind of know how to come up with the monthly payment from the loan standpoint, when you buy a house, there are a few major costs. One is the closing costs. And the closing costs are the fees you have to pay to buy the house. And they can add up to be some reasonable sum. So there are all these fees, loan origination fee, broker loan fee. I don't know what those all need, but you have to do them relative to like the title insurance fee. They do a title search to make sure that the person who's selling the house actually owns the house, so that somebody doesn't come by later and says, hey, actually he never owned the house, so he sold you a house he didn't own. It's kind of, how much do they all cost? Yeah, it's all processing fees. Like, yeah. Yeah, so for example, my brother, when my mother died, we sold her house. And because he got some property near where he lived, actually right next to where he lived, which was worth a fair amount, my older brother and I split the proceeds on the house. But we let him sell the house because he was in commercial real estate, so we figured he knew what he was doing, and he ultimately did find a buyer for it. But the other people wanted a real estate agent to handle all the details in terms of make sure that there was nothing messed up, and then you had to, of course, get lawyers involved. So yeah, some of it you might be able to do without a lawyer, but a lot of it's just not worth taking the chance. But it does come out to be a reasonable, for my mother's house, her house, I think it sold for like $280,000 or something like that. The closing costs were around $6,000. So it's usually about 3% of the sale price, something along those lines. In that case, usually the seller pays, the buyer pays the closing costs. We ended up negotiating that they paid a little more for the house. They didn't negotiate the price of the house down, but we paid the closing costs. And what that did is they didn't have to come up with that cash to pay the closing costs. It just and the assessed value was high enough that it was okay to do that. So sometimes you have that question of who pays the closing costs, but the standard is for the buyer to. So you have to come up with the money to pay the closing costs, and you also have to come up with the money to pay the down payment, which can vary from. Both of my daughters just bought a house. They paid 20% down, which is pretty significant. When we bought our house, I was just getting out of college, and we paid 5%. There's a difference. Why would you pay more as a down payment. Well, one thing is your loan's smaller. Secondly is you can probably get a better rate because you already have equity in the house, so it makes it safer for the bank if something goes wrong in terms of to get the total value that they have loaned. So you get a lower interest rate, you get lower payment. Of course, that cash that you had in the bank, you now don't have anymore. So that's an issue. You have what was the other thing I was going to say? If you pay more than 10% down, typically you don't have to pay what's called mortgage. Not what's it called? It's called. It'll come to me in a second. I've got it written down, but it's an extra payment that you have to pay per month as insurance, because people who put less down are probably more likely to default on the mortgage, as well as so it'll come to me here in a second. Okay, so you got to pay for closing costs. Now, if you're selling the house, you pay the realtor between 3 and 6% of the sale price. So a $300,000 house, you'd pay $18,000 for the realtor. That is negotiable to some extent, but you have to negotiate that with your. Now, once you have the house, you have the payment on the loan, but there are other things that you have to take into consideration. As a renter, you don't have to do a lot of this stuff. So you've got taxes, insurance, and maintenance. So the taxes, mostly we're talking about property taxes, and that can vary considerably depending upon where you live. So in Covington, my house has a property tax of around $1,000 a year, which is about $80 a month, which is not bad. If you live in northern New Jersey, a similar house, besides costing more, would probably have property taxes about $8,000 a year. So 8 times the amount for property taxes. Yeah, they do. They don't do, I don't know if it's income tax or something. There is some less tax, but ultimately they are taxed more than we are. But their property is taxed a lot more for sure. So depending upon where you are, the property taxes can be reasonable, like here, or unreasonable or very high. Then you have homeowners insurance. So that's, for our house right now, it's about $500 or $600 a year. And it just depends upon the value of your house. And then you have maintenance, which can be certain, there's some rules of thumb in terms of how much maintenance you have or improvements. So most houses you buy, if they're not brand spanking new, there are things you want to do to your house. So our house, we have probably spent as much as the value of the original purchase price of the house on maintenance or improvements. So I'm going to give you a short list of what we've done. We removed all the carpet. We refinished the hardwood floors. We have this is over 30 years. We've had 2 roofs put on, new siding, new windows, new furnace, new water heater, remodeled the kitchen, put on a sunroom, refinished the basement, redid the laundry room, repaved the driveway. It just adds up over and over and over again. I mean, the house is nicer than when we bought it, but you can, depending upon what you want to do, you can spend a lot of money over the years just to improve things, or just maintenance things like replacing furnaces and hot water heaters. There's no choice there. Appliances break. There's a lot of maintenance involved in a house. So that's my list of all the things that we've done. Okay, so those are all the costs. So we have a spreadsheet we're going to look at in a second, which will look at these for a specific example. Now, there are some tax benefits of owning a home if you do what's called itemized deductions, which you haven't probably had to do. And it really only works most of the time, if you own a home or if you give a lot of money to charity, as far as reducing your tax burden. But depending upon where you are, the tax benefits of home ownership are less. in Covington, it's probably not that big of an advantage from a tax standpoint, and I'll explain why in a second. If you live in New Jersey and you have a big house with a well-paying job, then the tax advantages can be more significant. So it also depends upon where you are in the loan. You get the most tax benefit in the beginning of the loan because you're paying the most interest at the beginning of the loan. At the end of the loan, there's not that much tax benefit. So I do standard deductions because I don't have a house, and there's no way that the things that are part of itemized deductions. So again, you guys probably have never done itemized deductions, so here's a little bit of idea of the main things. First, the biggest one is usually the interest on a home loan. You used to be able to deduct the interest on a car loan, but they don't do that anymore. Yeah, I guess it's not a luxury. The second thing is your state income tax. So you can include that in your itemized deductions. Then you have property taxes, which these are my numbers for Covington. Now, if you again northern New Jersey, I don't know whether they have state income tax, so you may pay more in property tax and less in state tax. Then you have personal property tax, which is on your car and other stuff. That's not as big as it used to be. And then you can medical expenses, but typically you have to be pretty sick to be able to claim enough to be able to actually deduct medical expenses. Some percentage minimum, and then you can claim above that minimum, but the minimum's a lot of money. Yes. Yeah, well, that could be, yeah, depending on what they do with health care. Yeah. So if I add all these numbers up, I'm giving $2,000 a year to charity or church or something like that. I'm not very generous when he goes to church, or at least in this example. And so you get $13,700. Now this standard deduction is this is from a few years ago, standard deduction is $11,900. So it's really only above the amount above your standard deduction that really gives you a tax benefit. So if my itemized deductions are the same as my standard deductions, all the things that I claimed here don't help me in my taxes at all. So if you are a modest person making modest amounts with a modest home and a low interest rate, the chances are that the tax benefits of owning a home are not that great. If you are living in a high tax area, you're paying a lot of state tax, and these add up all the stuff that's not interest for your house adds up to your standard deduction, then anything above that you're getting a tax benefit from. So you have to they always sell you that, the tax benefits of owning a home, but it all depends upon where you are. It actually is more beneficial to richer people than it is to not so rich people, because of this fact that the standard deduction is always there. So what my advice is, when they try to say, but you'll save this much in your taxes, you have to look into it a little more detail. It may not be as big of a benefit as you think they sell it as. And you can go online and you can create a table. This is borrowing $165,000, and it shows the payment schedule. And you can see that the payment schedule looks exactly like the one for the car, because it's exactly the same calculation. You start with a balance of $165,000. The first month, your payment is $836.03. Your interest for that month is $618. The excess is the principal paid. That reduces your balance by that amount, so that next month your interest is a little bit less because your balance is a little bit less. And just like with a car loan, the interest becomes lower, the principal paid becomes larger percentage-wise. You pay off, you keep paying until the balance is zero, and then you have a house. You paid off your house. And with a fixed interest rate, the payments stay constant. But when you looked at the car loan, this was smaller than that. In this case, the interest is much larger than that. So we'll look at the result of a house loan in just a second. So before I do that, this is a little more tax information. Most of you guys are probably in the 10 or 15% range, but these are the marginal tax rates for this year, for last year. So if you make up to $18,000, this is for married. If you make up to $18,550, you pay a 10% income tax on that taxable income. Now you may not pay any income tax because by the time you take your deduction for yourself, that may be enough to make it so your taxable income is zero. Then you will pay no tax. But if you do have a taxable income greater than zero, you'll pay 10% on the first up to $18,000. And then when you make more than that, then you pay 15% federal income tax. I think people, again, try to tell you, which is wrong, is, you know, oh, what if I earn one more dollar than $75,300, I had to pay 25% on that total amount. Well, the reality is you pay 10% on the first $18,550 you earn, and then the amount beyond that you pay the higher tax rate. Well, it's just some people would, yeah, they'll take. So each, you have to break it up into the first $18,000 of tax you at the lowest rate, and say you make $50,000, and then $50,000 minus 18, that excess, they'll charge you at the higher rate. And then if you make more than, you know, the next one. So that extra, you're paying, say if you make one more dollar than $75,300, that $1 they're taxing you at 25%, and then the rest of it they're taxing in this way. So there's no way that, hey, I'm going to earn $1 more and I'm going to make less. You always make more. It's just you get taxed, that marginal additional dollars get taxed at a higher rate. So if your husband or wife says, I'm not working that overtime because if I go, you know, I'm going to make less money because I'll be at a higher tax rate. No. That extra money may be taxed at a higher rate, but it's not going to. You're always going to make more money the more you work. If somebody tells you that, that's because they want to go fishing or hunting instead of working. And nobody's, you know, even at the highest tax rate, 39.6%, I mean, you got to make over $460,000 to do that. So that's probably not going to be the normal kind of person. You're still making 60% of that amount, over $466,950. Okay. The reason I'm showing this is because the amount that you save because of the itemized deductions is higher. You save a higher percentage if you're at a higher tax bracket. So the mortgage interest deduction is more advantageous the higher tax rate you are. Okay, so there's the homework for this section, just 4 problems. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a spreadsheet that talks about all the things that we've just talked about, and to kind of give you an idea of the order of magnitude of some of these things. Also to encourage you, you know, if you ever, when you get to that point, you don't have to rely completely on the banker or the real estate agent. There are tools out there that are pretty simple and they're free to let you analyze, to think about it. You know, whether it makes sense to buy a house or to rent. A lot of people are finding renting is actually making more sense from an economic standpoint for various reasons, which I will talk about. Besides, you don't have to cut the grass if you're renting, unless you're renting a house. That's one nice thing. You know, when you get older, you don't want to do maintenance. You're not, you know, you'd rather just sit around and watch watch North Carolina beat Gonzaga or something like that. Yeah, I mean that's once you've paid off the mortgage, then you don't have that expenditure, so you have that excess income. So there is the advantage. There are advantages for owning a home besides just the monetary. Okay, so let's let me open up this spreadsheet. Yeah, one of the issues with millennials is, I think, one of the issues is a lot of them have large college loan debts. Yeah, so if you can't get a down payment, you can't buy a house, and okay, so here we go. Let's just let's look at this particular example. So here, there's a purchase price of $200,000. We're only paying $5,000, which is only 2.5%. 10% would be $20,000, but accumulating $20,000 is not that easy. So the main, I finally thought of what the insurance calls. It's called private mortgage insurance. So if you have a down payment that's less than 10%, typically you have to pay private mortgage insurance. Probably the lower the down payment, the more percent you have to pay for the private mortgage insurance, which we'll get to in a second. The length of the loan is 30 years, which is typical. Your yearly interest rate here, they're showing 6.5%. Your yearly property tax is at 1.8% of the value of the house. Then you've got private mortgage insurance, homeowners insurance, which is some percentage of the value of the house, of the replacement cost of the house, typically. Then you got your private mortgage insurance, which they have at $150 per month. So that's pretty significant. Then you have yearly maintenance costs of $700 per month, per year, and $1,300 for improvements. So using that, my house as an example, if you do $2,000 per year times 30 years, that would mean I've spent about $60,000 on, and that's probably pretty close. So those are I would say pretty accurate. You also put in your tax rate, and that's for when you calculate the tax benefits of home ownership. Okay, so let's see what we got next here. So your monthly house payment. So just on the principal of $195,000, your payment is $1,232.53. So that's paying off your loan. Then you have property tax, which they say is 1.8% of the value. So that's per month. That's $300 a month. So that's $3,600 a month, $3,600 a year for property tax, which is somewhere between what I pay and what New Jersey pays. Then you've got your insurance, which includes both private mortgage insurance and your homeowner's insurance. That's included in the amount that you pay. You don't do that separately. It comes in your payment. So your monthly housing payment is $1,749.20. So just looking at the amount you borrowed is, that's about 3/4 of the total payment that you have to come up with, which seems kind of high. But in just again to give you some examples of my daughters. Jennifer lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, New York, and its rent was probably about $2,200 a month. Heather lived in an apartment in Alexandria, and it was a good deal. It was an older home, but it was a good deal, and it was about $1,600. But most apartments were around $2,000 a month. So you're paying, that's just for a one-bedroom or two-bedroom apartment. Here we're talking about a house. Now you couldn't buy an apartment in New York City for $195,000. They do make more money. Yep. Okay, then the other costs, that's just your payment. Then you take your monthly costs for maintenance. So they took the yearly amount divided by 12, same with improvements. So there's your monthly home ownership expenses, your payment plus these, and this money you don't necessarily put away, but you're going to be spending somehow or another. Whether it's on a yearly basis, you might accumulate it. You're not going to do yearly stuff. You might do something every 3 or 4 years, and then it would cost 3 or 4 times as much in terms of the budget. So now you make an adjustment to your monthly expenses from a tax perspective, and they're assuming that your itemized deductions that don't include the house payment are as high as your standard deduction. So all of the money that you're paying in interest, you get a tax benefit from it. So the tax benefit you get is on the interest portion. This is kind of like the average interest for the entire loan. So early on you get a little bit more, and later on you get some less than this, but this would be the average amount. So if you take this number multiplied by 25%, which is your tax rate, then you would save $337.86 a month on taxes. So you take this number and subtract that number, and you get back to $1,578. So that's the net cost of owning a home. So the tax benefits are about what, maybe 3 out of 18, which would be 1 out of 6. It's about 16%. You're lowering your cost of living or cost of owning a home by about 1/6, 16%, because of the tax. But again, this only works if all of your deductions without the interest meet your standard deductions. If they don't, then you're not going to get as much of a tax benefit from it. And so here is just some information that might be of interest. One is, for this $195,000 house that you pay a loan for 30 years at 6.5%, this is how much you pay for the original price of the house. This is how much interest you pay. So your interest, the interest you pay is almost twice the value of the house. This shows the balance over time. The reason it starts off at a lower slope is because I'm paying mostly interest. But as I pay the principal down, the amount going to interest becomes less, and the amount going to principal becomes more. And then by the time you get to the end of the loan, you're paying it off pretty quickly, much more quickly. The cumulative interest, same thing. Early on, you're accumulating the interest pretty quickly. As you get to near the end of the loan, you're not paying as much interest. And the cumulative principal goes from 0 to the price of the house, the loan amount. And then you can come up with this amortization schedule, which in this case goes for the entire 30 years. So let's say after 1 year, how much of the house do I own? What's my equity in my house? You hear about equity. Equity means the amount that the house is worth minus the amount that you owe on your loan. So let's assume at first that the housing price doesn't change during that year. So you pay your balance on your loan is $192,820. So you have equity of about $7,200. You have paid for that. You've paid. Where's the cumulative interest here? You've paid $12,000 in interest and about $8,000 in principal. So you paid about $20,000. So this interest is not helping your equity at all. Now, if the housing prices increase, then you have the equity of your down payment. So you got $5,000 equity, but you paid them that. So it's kind of hanging around there, and then you got this additional equity as you pay the principal off. Now, if your housing price went up to $210,000, then you'd have the $10,000 difference between your house value and your original purchase price, plus this difference between the original purchase price and the balance. And that's what a home equity loan is. Basically what you're doing when you get a home equity loan, you're using your home as collateral. And the difference in the two values, the value of your house and the balance of your loan, is your equity plus the increase in purchase price. That's your equity in your house, and you can borrow against that because the bank figures that if you default on the home equity loan, they can get the house. They can get the house and sell it, and they'll come out net pretty even. Now, the reason home equity loans are low is because they do have collateral in your house, and also somebody who is buying a house is probably reasonably financially stable. They've established a history of paying off stuff, so the credit's probably pretty good. And what else could you say about the home equity? So that, you know, that's why home equity loans are low, because the risks for the bank are reasonably low compared to other kind of loans. But there's the risk that you're going to lose your house at some point, and so that's another motivating factor. I'm going to make sure I pay off my home equity loan because I have something that I could lose considerably. So there's losing your house versus losing your car. That's a big motivating difference. And if you come all the way down to the bottom, you know, after 360 payments, there we are at the last payment. So your balance prior to the last payment is $1,225.89. Your interest on the last loan last month is only $6.64. And so, but this is the cumulative amount that you've paid off. It's $195,000. That's your principal. And the interest is $248,211. So how do you reduce that paying interest? Well, one is to have a lower interest rate. Secondly is to pay your loan off sooner, because you're going to, but of course, having a shorter loan makes your monthly payment higher. So sometimes, you know, you're limited. As I said, what we did is we started out as new homeowners. We wanted to have a monthly payment that was low, so we went with 30-year mortgage. But once we started getting some salary increases, I'd use that salary increase to pay off more of the loan. Also, after a couple of years, we refinanced it so that we could lower the interest rate. And we ultimately ended up paying off the loan in 14 years, so that saved us a lot of money over the long run. And, you know, now, as I said, when our kids went to college, we could pay for their college with the money that we were paying for the loan. And then once they got through college, all that money, now we have that money, you know, I can teach here instead of having to work at Midwest-Vaco because I can afford to do it. So, you know, there's benefits. I don't know if this is, you might not consider this a benefit for me working here, but, you know, we have much more flexibility than if we had moved. You know, one of the decisions you make when you get out of college is, where am I moving to? And what's the cost of living? So that was one of the decisions why we moved to Covington. You know, why would you move to Covington? Well, the cost of living was lower. When I got my master's degree, the job market was really good, and I had like 8 job offers, and they were all over the place. And you know, there was the salary to consider, but a big factor was actually where we were living. So it was interesting. So one of the companies, when I interviewed as an undergraduate, which was just a few companies because I decided to get my master's degree, I had this interview with Exxon, and the guy who was my interview, he's like, he's all enthusiastic. Yeah, you need to come work for Exxon or whatever. But then I decided to get my master's degree right after that, so I didn't get a job. When I got my master's degree, I interviewed with Exxon again, and I got trip to Houston, Texas. And, ooh, yeah, living in Houston, Texas. But the interesting thing was the place they wanted me to work was their exploration research department. Well, where's all the exploration? Not in the United States. It was like in Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or, you know, everywhere else. And so they were talking about, the job sounded boring to start with, but then they were talking about, well, you live a couple of years here and a couple of years there, all these countries. And I guess if you're young, you didn't have a family. But I was young, but I did have a family. And it was just I just was not that thrilled about working for them, even though they probably would have paid the largest amount. And then even if Houston was the best choice, you know, Houston is not the humidity and in the summer and the heat. Oh, God, it was flat. I like mountains. So that was kind of, I think we both mutually figured out that we were not interested in each other, maybe because I just was not very enthusiastic about the whole thing. So that was the one place I didn't get a job offer from, was Exxon. But then I had an interview with Boeing Aircraft in Seattle. And that had, you know, that was the job was interesting. Seattle. No, I like Seattle, but it was expensive to live there. It was very far away from our families, and we had a little girl, and we actually were having another baby, so there's two babies, you know, so you had the family thing, the expense. The weather can kind of be depressing in Seattle. It rains a lot, so I decided not to do that. We ended up, when I got my master's degree, I went to work for General Electric in upstate New York, which it was a nice place. You know, it wasn't bad. It was cold in the winter, but it was okay. But yeah, anyway, you make those decisions about cost of living there would have been reasonable. But anyway, both of my daughters, of course, now, you know, one lives in New York City and the other one lives in Northern Virginia, two very high cost of living places, and their mortgage payments are more than I could ever think about paying. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of home ownership. You know, I own a home, so I'm not going to bash home ownership, but there are lots of things to consider when you do it. You know, what are the things so here's a review of what you have to consider. One is, you know, you're going to have to come up with closing costs and a down payment to buy your house. That's actually, that's another side story. One of the ministers that's involved in this lunch thing was talking to Tina Dressler. He was asking her questions. And basically what it came down to was, for people who are lower middle class as far as their income, getting to that point where you can buy a home is difficult because of the fact you need closing costs and you need a down payment. And to buy a house that's, you know, the lower price house you get, the more likely you're going to have to spend money to fix it up to make it livable or reasonable. So there's this balancing act. But if you're paying 10% down, even on a $100,000 house, that's $10,000, which is, you know, in the scheme of things, is not huge, but it's a stretch for people in that area, especially if you got health care and all these other expenses that come along. So how do you help people to be able to get that down payment and the closing costs to buy a house? Because sometimes buying a house can be cheaper than renting, but it's getting over that. It's like in chemistry. It's called the what's it called, activation energy or something. You know, you got to get a certain energy before the chemical reaction can start, and if you can't get your down payment, then you can't get to that point of home ownership, especially in this area where homes are cheap, relatively speaking, and interest rates are low. What's that now? To raise money. Okay, so that's, and then, you know, the cost of owning a home is not just the loan payment. You've got taxes, insurance, maintenance, those can add up to be fairly substantial. And there are some tax advantages to home ownership, but you got to be careful. Your particular situation may make it, especially if you're in a low-cost area, you may not get that as much of a tax benefit as a bank might tell you. And the other thing is, there are online resources that can help you kind of work through the questions before you think about, am I ready to buy a house or not? You shouldn't go into it completely uninformed. And using these spreadsheets in this particular tool, you can get a pretty good idea of what it costs to do that. But ultimately, what's one advantage is right now I don't have a house payment, so I don't have a rent payment. I do have to pay gas and water and those kind of things, but the sum of those is a lot less than I would pay for renting and we can you can make improvements so that you can make your house your own. So there's so the latest on the healthcare thing. They're trying again. They're trying to make some compromises with the Freedom Caucus, which is this group of conservative right-wing congressmen. The latest proposal is that they'd leave it up to states whether there were minimum standards. They're trying to put the blame on somebody else. The states could decide whether there were minimum requirements for health insurance, like maternity care or chemotherapy, or you can put all kinds of limits on it. And it's an interesting philosophical thing, because the reason the premiums are higher is because they're covering stuff. So the only way you can make the premiums lower is by covering less stuff, like not covering pre-existing conditions or not covering cancer treatment. So, as a healthy person that lives a healthy lifestyle, should you subsidize people who are not living a healthy lifestyle? That's, you can look at it from that perspective. But the thing is, even if you live a healthy lifestyle, what happens. Things happen. And so you may think you're being smug about it. I eat well and I exercise all the time, so I don't really need insurance. And then you get cancer, you get a heart attack anyway, like that guy in what's the Biggest Loser. He was a big health buff, but he almost died from a heart attack. So you can't always. That's what insurance is, for unpredictable stuff. That's ultimately what it is. You can't predict it. So you have to decide. Yeah, I'll have lower premiums, but the chances are I might get something that they won't pay for, and I'll go bankrupt. So it's an interesting. So now by offering the things that they want, the House Freedom Caucus does not like having to have insurance companies accept people with pre-existing conditions. That's one thing Trump said he would keep, but now he's wavering. What he's saying is, well, we're going to leave it up to the states. So that's passing the buck. It's not my fault. It's the state's problem. You didn't. Keeping children on their policies until 26. That's something that's up for negotiation, which affects you guys. They're in favor of that, but the Freedom Caucus is not in favor of that. And so again, they may leave it up to the states, which is a way of getting it passed through the Congress. But the question, and then do you make where you live decisions on health care? Yeah, because the people who can't afford it. Yeah. Well, then you just don't have people that are, you just have, well, I'm not going to say that here. Yeah, so there's a lot of things involved there, so it's not going to be good. No matter what happens, they'll say it's great health care. All it is it'll give you more choices, more bad choices. That's the risk. But again, from the other perspective, how much do I pay for other people's bad living? I don't know. Or are there cases where the money isn't worth spending on it? And that's death panels, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. You have to make, if you don't want to spend an unlimited amount on health care, you have to make decisions about what you should or shouldn't do. And you hate to have to do that, but sometimes you have to do those kind of things, unfortunately. Okay, the last topic in this section is about the different kind of investments. So we've talked about, we'd like to get a certain return on our investment so we can retire. The spreadsheet we looked at showed 6% while you're trying to accumulate wealth, which usually means when you're working, and when you're spending your wealth is when you're retired. So to be able to match those targets so that you can retire comfortably or retire at all, how do you get to that point? Because it's not a, of course, if the risk was the same for all investments, you'd always pick the highest return. But unfortunately, the higher return usually is more risky. So let's just talk about those kinds of different investment options. And of course, there are more than this, but these are the kind of the general ones that a normal human being and not some rich person that can gamble their money. So the first thing is what I call savings, and the savings is basically, if you go to your hometown bank, their business model. Their business model is that people will put money in the bank. Typically, they will give you they have CDs, which has a certain interest rate that is mostly set by the market. And the market is mostly set by the government, the Federal Reserve, what they set as the interest rates. So let's say it's 1%. You get 1% of your CD. So then the bank lends that money locally to people doing the two main things that you borrow money for, which is buying cars or buying homes. And so the interest rates that they charge for the loans has to be greater than the amount they're giving for the deposits. Now, of course, because that's how a bank works. They have to charge more for the loan than for what they're giving for the money. And that difference has to be sufficient enough to pay the salaries, to pay the loan on the bank building, and to give some return to the people who have shares in the bank, as well as cover any losses from people defaulting on their loans. So I was saying home loans now maybe 4.5%, something like that. So there's about 3% difference between the two, which is kind of normal. On the deposit side, you basically agree to this contract with the bank. I'll leave my money in for a certain amount of time, 12 months, 5 years. You'll give me a interest rate, typically compounded continuously. And a lot of people will just leave that money in the bank, so after 5 years or whatever the term is, they could then take it out without penalty, and they get a larger amount than they had originally. And by that time you may have retired and you may need the money, or you saved it for something else. But you always get the amount that they say, so your value at the end is always greater than the value at the beginning. If the bank goes belly up, they have insurance through the government, FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, that they will pay those deposits. They guarantee those deposits up to a certain amount of money. It used to be $200,000. I think it's higher nowadays. So it's very predictable. The risk to you is very low. But because of the risk being low, you don't get a whole lot of money back from it, relatively speaking, compared to other investments. And there is no volatility because it's guaranteed. It's the same amount every year that you've agreed to the contract. So there is no volatility. What is volatility? It means, well, I could go up and I could go down. I could even just going up at different rates would still be volatility. So it's very predictable, but it's you're not going to get a huge amount of benefit out of it, especially at the current rates that we have. The second is what we call bonds. And bonds are kind of like what we're doing with savings, except in this case, the people that are loaning you, the people who need the money are not individuals for houses and cars. They're businesses that need equipment and other stuff that associated with the business, like paying people or buying inventory. So, but you know, those kinds of things, paying people especially, there's no collateral there. If you're buying equipment, there's collateral, but you know, there's more specific to a particular industry, and you might buy shelves, new shelves, and then you've used them, and then you sell them at an auction, and you're not going to get the full value. So there's the risk for the people who are issuing the bonds is higher than the risk that you would get from a local bank. So because of the risk being higher, they are going to charge a higher interest rate, which also means people who are providing that money to lend to the bank, to lend to the companies, are also going to get a higher return than you would in the bank. So we would say the risk is intermediate relative to savings versus the third choice is stocks. So the return is intermediate as well. Instead of like 1 or 2%, you might be getting 4 or 5%. And the bonds actually value varies. So you think, well, I'm making a loan to a bank, and they're paying a fixed rate, and that's agreed to. That's true. But bonds are traded kind of like stocks. So if you've lent money to companies at a high rate, then somebody who has some money may say, hey, can I buy those bonds, and so I can get that higher rate, but I'm going to sell them to, the guy says, well, I'll sell them to you, but I'm going to sell them to you more than I paid for them because they're getting good rate, and they're not defaulting on the loan, so it's reasonably risky. So the value of the bonds can vary just like the value of stocks, but you're still lending people money. It's still lending. So the value can go up and down. It tends to be less volatile than the third kind of investment, which is called stocks, or some people call them equities. So what's happening there is instead of lending the money, you're buying part of the company. And so if the company goes bankrupt and then the value of the company is zero, you lose all your money. So that's very risky. But the amount of money that a company can make, their profit that they make from whatever investment it is, whatever they're selling or making, the return is dependent upon a lot of things, but the potential for making more return than a bond fund is better. You know, you get a higher chance of that happening. And so typically your return for stocks is the highest, but it also has the highest risk. And it also, as you know, if you watch the news, it can go up and down very quickly. So there's a couple of reasons you wouldn't buy stocks. One is if you're 85 and your lifespan isn't very long, and the stock market tanks when you're 86, you're not going to be around when it rebounds back to its original value or to greater than that. So typically if you're older, the older you get, the less stock you own, unless you're going to leave it to your kids, and then they can continue it on. So so you kind of have to balance these three things: risk, return, and volatility. And it all depends upon your tolerance for risk. Some people's tolerance is low. My wife's tolerance is low. Mine, yeah, some people's tolerance should be lower, but it's not. Because what the scenario, here's a scenario it happened with my wife and happened when I was talking to Kathy Nicely yesterday. You know, things are going well, the stock market's strong, you're like, okay, I'm going to buy some stocks because everybody else is doing really well. And then the stock market tanks. And you're like, oh my God, we're going to lose all our money. Sell, sell, sell. But it's only half its original value. We're only going to get, yeah, but that's at least half the original value. Sell the stuff. And then what happens is the stock market comes back up and it regains its value fairly quickly, and then it passes where it was before. And so those people who bought the stocks originally were not tolerant to the risk, and they end up losing money because of it. Yeah, right. Yeah, they overreact. So it takes a certain amount of either ignoring things and just letting it do what it does, which is kind of what I do. But there's also just balancing each kind of investment depending upon where you are. As you're younger, you're more tolerant of risk because you're planning on using that 30 years from now. Whereas if you're 85 years old, you're going to use it pretty soon. So there's the balance between those two. And also, so next time we'll talk about more about these different kinds of investments and about what's really going on there. It may not make you feel any better about stocks, what I explained, but at least you'll have some idea. You'll be informed as far as that's concerned.